there she is. Ms. Maposa, you're more than welcome.
All right. Just a second.
Oh, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. And I just wanted to thank the organizers of this forum for doing so. I think it's very important for us to meet and discuss important issues together as women. I apologize for my terrible lighting. And I also am just going to be speaking straight to you. I have not prepared a presentation. As indicated, my topic for today is the promotion of women's rights in Africa. This is a topic that is very close to my heart. I often speak on it, I often write on it, and I just felt that I would share a few thoughts with you today on this special occasion about how I feel that women's rights can be promoted in Africa, in our region particularly, because often we talk about women's rights globally, but I feel like the issues that we face as African women are unique compared to women from other jurisdictions and women from other regions of the world. Our journey really begins prior to many of African countries attaining independence. The war for the realization of fundamental rights for African women is distinctive. And this is because while first wave feminists in first world countries were advocating for civil rights, women in Africa were engrossed in an entirely different war against colonialism. So while our white counterparts were advocating for their right to vote in Europe, we were still in the depths of civil wars, trying to attain independence from our colonizers and so forth. It was only after the independence of African states that women could start challenging laws across the continent, which they felt discriminated unjustly on the basis of gender. Now, more than 50 years later, after the end of colonialism, we have faced the question of to what extent has the promise of the call for fundamental rights been realized for African women? The 21st century found women facing ongoing difficulties to gaining education and employment on the same level as African men. To date, women still have serious problems in the areas of marriage, divorce, inheritance, and family law in general. I speak from a law perspective because I am a law researcher, so please forgive me if I tend to go on a tangent about the legal instruments that we have in Africa. But I think it's also important to point out that in addition to these discriminatory laws that we had in Africa, women have also had to deal with the scourge of HIV and AIDS, which has inflicted untold hardships on women. The late 20th and 21st centuries have been marked by localized wars in more than a dozen countries, with women frequently the victims. So while most countries have decolonized, we still find that there are many countries in Africa where certain wars are taking place, mostly really because of religious disputes. For example, in Nigeria, where there are often issues with the Boko Haram and so forth. And so despite all of these challenges, I think it's just important to also note that the last half of the 20th century brought expanded opportunities for education, increased political involvement, and improved family expectations for women. There is no doubt that African women's long walk to freedom has been starting to yield results, although this has been painful and slow. I think to just point out some of the legal developments that African women have achieved through advocating for themselves, the African Union has a legally binding protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And this protocol deals solely with the rights of women in Africa. The protocol is a win for us because it spells out clearly the women's rights to equality and non-discrimination in a number of areas. This protocol has also been ratified by many African states, meaning many states are actually starting to include the provisions of this protocol in their own domestic laws, or they're using it to inspire laws to effect change for African women in their countries. Now, this protocol, as I've indicated, was the culmination of persistent advocacy efforts and demands from women's rights organizations and gender activists who called on the African Union to adopt an African human rights instruments that would address the persisting issue of women's rights. Many African states have then moved to enhance constitutional protections for African women. And over the last decades, we have seen the emergence of legislation to address violence against women, including sexual violence. I think the previous speaker has also highlighted that. And I think these policies are very important. But the question then is whether these policies are being implemented for effective change in the lives of African women. Because it's one thing for us to have laws in place, but if those laws are not being implemented to work or to create effective change, then they are just there for decoration, they're just there for the aesthetic. So the question is, are these laws, are these policies making a difference for us? I'll start by talking about political representation, because this is covered in the protocol by the African Union. The Maputo Protocol, which is also the African Union Protocol, guarantees women's rights to political participation and decision-making at all levels of society. This protocol calls on states to take positive action to promote participative governance and equal participation of women, including through the enactment of affirmative action. So at the time when this protocol was brought into force, the AU decided to adopt a 50% quota for women's representation. This was to encourage, for example, states to include at least 50% women in their parliaments, or 50% for parliaments have at least a 50% capacity for women. Now, obviously, this has not been made by all African states. Over the years, we have seen South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda reaching at least 30% of the benchmark for their legislatures. Rwanda has been rather forthcoming in this regard, with more than 50% representation in its parliament. The last time I checked, it was almost 64%. I'm not sure if this is still the case, but it has been one of the best countries in the world in terms of female representation in the legislature. A few other countries, including Nigeria, have seen women assume non-traditional ministerial portfolios in defense and finance, for example. And Liberia has made history by becoming the first African country to elect into office a female head of state. Many other countries, not really many, but a number of other countries in Africa have proceeded to make similar moves in terms of female leadership in the African context. However, when you look at the average of African countries and just how many countries have actually taken note or made efforts to include women in leadership organizations, we find that only 23.6% of African countries have actually made moves to accommodate women. And even in cases where women are accommodated in positions of leadership, women in Africa experience challenges in participating in decision-making due to social norms and religious and cultural factors that reinforce gender discrimination and exclusion from political life. Additionally, female leaders often face harassment, intimidation, and violence, including sexual violence from political candidates, political party officials, rival politicians, and the general public, which often tries to dissuade women from engaging in politics. In a couple of years ago, the Interparliamentary Union surveyed 55 women parliamentarians from 39 countries, including 18 sub-Saharan countries. 44% of female parliamentarians indicated that they had received death threats, rape, beatings, or abduction during their parliamentary term. 65.5% had experienced humiliating sexual or sexist remarks, while 81.8% said they had received psychological violence. In the vast majority of cases, humiliating sexual and sexist remarks were made in parliament. This just goes to show how much of a long way we have to go, not only in terms of creating space for female leaders in Africa, but also accommodating them once they are in that space. Apart from political representation, I think it's also important to have a look at how African countries are implementing economic, social, and cultural rights on behalf of women or to the effect of women. The Maputo Protocol calls on states to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women and to promote and protect the right to equal opportunity and access to education and training. Women and girls globally are disproportionately affected by poverty due to economic and social exclusion in society. And this has negative impacts on their quality of life. In Africa, women and girls have challenges in accessing education and training opportunities. As also indicated by the previous speaker, women are generally paid less than their male counterparts. They have limited access to nutritious sources of food, clean water, sanitation, adequate shelter, and they have limited access to resources, including property, land, and access to credit, denying them economic opportunities to improve their lives. According to the United Nations Development Fund, economic and workplace disparities between African women and men continue to be the norm rather than the exception. Currently, we have about 9 million girls between the age of 6 to 11 that will never go to school. And half of adult women in Africa cannot read or write. Women and girls carry the bulk of domestic and reproductive labor in the household, and this is often unpaid and time-consuming, which takes away their earning capacity in future and traps them in a cycle of dependency and poverty. I think at this point, it's important to just highlight how if we do not combat the cycle of dependency, if we do not give girls the opportunity to get education, to pursue careers, then we are a long way from achieving the gender equality that we so desperately seek in Africa. And despite the contributions that women and girls make through paid and unpaid labor, they are often excluded from decision-making in all spheres of development, and they have limited influence on sustainable development within their communities and countries. This is something that I believe as a continent, we are still yet to work on. And another thing that I think is also just important to highlight, I'm very glad that we've had a discussion on gender-based violence because I believe it emanates from various sources. And one of the largest sources of violence against women in South Africa currently is the issue of child marriage, which is prevalent in Africa more than in any other country. In fact, 15 of the 20 countries with the highest rates of child marriage come from Africa. Prevalence is greatest in West and Central Africa, where it is estimated that 4 out of 10 women aged 20 to 24 were married before the age of 18. Most marriages of this nature can be tied back to religious and cultural practices. Now, this is not to say that all of African culture is bad or not effective or not good for any reason. I am all for promoting African culture, but I believe that it's also important for us to call out when certain aspects of African customary law discriminates or is to the disadvantage of the girl child. I'd like to highlight, for example, in Zimbabwe and South Africa, where there is a practice called ukutwala. Now, ukutwala is a practice traditionally that was used by a prospective husband to initiate marriage negotiations. In this case, normally the parents would not consent to the marriage, so the couple would agree that the man will fake kidnap the woman and take her to his house, and then thereafter, lobola negotiations or marriage negotiations would be initiated. However, over the years, this cultural practice has evolved and changed considerably into a destructive form that is contrary to its traditional observance. For example, this custom is being used to forcibly kidnap women or young girls rather, and force them into marriage with older men. This misapplied form of the practice can only be described as abhorrent. In its most abusive form, ukutwala is a forced abduction that exposes victims to rape and actual violence in order to coerce them into submission or into marriage. Now, child marriage in particular denies a range of human rights to the victims. For example, in most cases, these young girls must discontinue their education, they face serious health risks, and they are subject to early and multiple pregnancies, and they also suffer sexual and domestic violence. The prevalence of perversive practices in indigenous communities makes them difficult to challenge due to their strong links with culture. Cultural norms create a blurred line between right and wrong, because naturally, with practices like ukutwala, people would defend them as saying, but this is my culture. You cannot bring Western laws into it because this is how we've been practicing it for years. Neglecting the fact that this practice is actually developed to a point where it is now in violation of human rights. And for instance, in most African cultures previously, it was generally accepted that beating one's wife as a form of discipline is a legitimate action. It was not viewed as violence. It was only after attaining independence that women finally challenged such laws and challenge such discriminatory customs and say, no, but this is actually domestic violence. This is actually gender-based violence. And many academic authors have made reference to married men justifying domestic violence based on their customary right of chastisement. In response to harmful cultural practices, we've got the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which now instructs state parties to take all appropriate measures in order to modify or abolish existing customs and practices which constitute discrimination against women, with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudices and customary practices which are based on the idea of inferiority or the superiority of either sex, or also based on stereotypical roles for men and women. Naturally, states have to take steps to eliminate discrimination against women in all matters relating to marriage and family relations. We've also got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which addresses the equality of spouses. In terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, men and women of full age are entitled to equal rights to marriage during the marriage and its dissolution. This is a very important provision for us to have under international law, because previously you would find that the husband would be in a superior position to the wife in a marriage, meaning that in the case of a divorce, the woman would most likely be left with nothing, because it would be argued that she did not contribute to anything, even though she took on unpaid labor, such as taking care of children, taking care of the household. And we are moving closer to a place where we can now say, no, this is not okay. And women's rights should be recognized, not only in the public sphere, but also in the home, between spouses, between husbands and wives. And I think this is very important. Of course, there are some states that have taken measures, and countries such as South Africa who now have legislation to recognize the equality of spouses. However, there are still many other African countries where women are still, or wives rather, are still seen as inferior to their male counterparts. And I think we still have a long way to go in terms of ensuring that international law is applied in all countries domestically into domestic legislation. But I also just want to highlight that as much as we can have policies, as much as we can have laws, and these are important concrete changes to have on a national level, there is no single solution to ending gender discrimination. So I don't think we should only look at laws and think this is the answer to everything. In order to achieve the goal of gender equality, African governments should commit to comprehensive change, which includes a range of measures, including legal reform and enforcement, access to quality education, and the dissemination of sexual and reproductive health information and services. We must also promote girl empowerment, and change harmful social norms. In as far as harmful social norms are concerned, I believe it is every single person's role in society to challenge harmful social norms that we have, to challenge cultural norms that we have that often take advantage of women or often put women in a subordinate position. So it is our role as civil societies, I see we've got organizations in here, it is our role to challenge existing laws that may discriminate against the girl child. It is our role as advocates, it is our role as women in Africa to stand up and to fight against discrimination as a whole. The reason why we even have protocols in Africa that challenge discrimination is because some women were brave enough to stand up and challenge cultural norms, to challenge laws that we had in place that were discriminating against women. And once again, in our countries, in our organizations, we have the same duty. I think I'll stop there.